So hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining us in today's session on the Practitioner's Guide to Getting Started with Behavioral Science, a document that was created by the UN for the UN and various colleagues outside as well to get started with behavioral science. So for those of you who are new to the behavioral science group, my name is Mary McLennan. I lead the group, which is in the UN Innovation Network. I'm also the senior advisor in behavioral science in the executive office of the Secretary General. So I'm joined today by two colleagues. Unfortunately, one does not have her camera on, but we're working on it. So hopefully she'll be able to join us shortly. Claire Hobden is joining us from the ILO, where she's helped to really produce this document from the early stages to get it to where it is. And Lucy Martin is with us as a UN Behavioral Science Fellow, and she's worked on particularly a section about administrative burden, which she'll speak to in her part of the presentation. So I'll just start by a bit of context and background in terms of behavioral science in the UN very, very briefly, and then sort of the introduction to the document. Following that, Claire will speak to some of the intricacies of, or the details around the steps. And then Lucy will conclude with some thoughts around sludge reduction overall, which is the administrative burden. So just a little bit about the group. So the group brings together over 1,000 UN colleagues from more than 60 entities and 110 countries. So quite a lot of colleagues across the UN system who are interested in behavioral science, and they really span in lots of ways, not only across geographies and domains such as health or climate or peace and security, but also with respect to experience with behavioral science. So, oh great, Claire's joined us now. In terms of experience with behavioral science, although we have some colleagues who are actually behavioral scientists themselves and applying behavioral science in their work, others are very much at the early stages of their journey and thinking this through, and that's really the majority of the group that we've interacted with, and that's why this document was created, to help those who are at the beginning to get started and to start leveraging all the momentum that we're seeing across the UN system. So I also wanted to highlight here some of the bigger picture pieces about behavioral science in the UN overall. So more recently, the Secretary General has come out with what's called our Common Agenda, which is essentially his plan for the second term, which started earlier this year and will go for the next 5 years. And it's intended to turbocharge the SDGs and really deliver on the mandates of the UN. Lots of really innovative areas there, and ambitious agenda for sure. But for the sake of our discussion today, what I wanted to highlight is what's called UN 2.0 and this quintet of change. So these are 5 areas that the Secretary General has deemed especially important to really make the UN more nimble and effective to deliver on this agenda. So they are behavioral science, which is why we're discussing this, as well as data, innovation, digital transformation, and strategic foresight. So that just gives you a bigger picture of where things are at those levels. And then I just wanted to start now with sort of the content of today's presentation. For those of you who are new to behavioral science, such that we're all on the same page, what is behavioral science? What we'll be talking about today, and what is this whole group about, and the initiative that we're speaking about today. So behavioral science, as we define it, refers to an evidence-based understanding for people actually to behave, make decisions, respond to programs, policies, and incentives in the real world. So what we do is we take a really deep dive understanding of how context shapes our decisions and ultimately our follow-on actions and behaviors. So it could be something like, so there are lots of things we can think about this in our everyday lives. Like, for instance, I want to exercise more or eat healthier, but sometimes the situations around me don't really make that conducive or easy for me to do. But when we start to think about how we can alter our environment, so for instance, I can keep my running shoes at an easily identifiable place, or I can start to fill my fridge with really healthy foods at eye level. These are very simple examples of what this whole field is about. But when we think about those essential concepts and ideas, there's lots we can draw when it comes to policymaking. And we think about the way the UN actually works overall. We can think about the impact of behavioral science in a number of ways. So for instance, increasing the impact of the UN's work around the world, increasing the efficiency. So we can often implement things that are relatively cheap and small that can have a big impact, but because we understand that context really well, we can achieve efficiency as well as impact gains. It can also save costs and time, so not just is measured in terms of impact, but also in other variables as well. And then also, as we'll speak to today, behavioral science takes a very evidence-based approach. So it draws from decades of literature, from anthropology, sociology, economics, many other fields, and we test where possible. So really try to have that rigor in what we do. And then lastly, simplifying administration. We'll speak a bit of that today as well. So now onto the guide. Hopefully it'll be in the chat if it's not there already. And what the guide essentially is, it was developed, as I said at the beginning of the session, for the UN system, by the UN system, really intends to be a resource for all of you to get started and to really think about how you could start thinking about behavioral science and how it relates to your work. So it was designed not only in consultation with UN entities, but also with various others who have applied behavioral science over a number of years. These include governments, academics, other international organizations, to really leverage lessons from as best we can across all of these areas to bring them to the UN system. So just to cover a few of the pieces within the guide, we'll walk you through them now, and then we'll have about quite a bit of time for questions afterwards. So we'll kind of take some time to walk you through the document overall. So if you look in the first section there, there's a section that talks about the features of behavioral science application. So I touched upon a little bit about this in the slide previously, but what makes behavioral science different or unique, or what about this field is remarkable that you might think about compared to other fields. So first is it's focused on behavior. So it's not about necessarily attitudes or beliefs or kind of these other metrics that we think about a lot of policies and programs of the UN, but we target a specific behavior, and we'll dive into a bit more about what that means in the next section. Secondly, it's evidence-based. Again, it draws from the decades of literature from diverse disciplines, and we also test where possible. Thirdly, it's context-driven. So as I said earlier, it's about really understanding the context in which people are and taking that insight and that understanding and bringing that into our analysis and the work that we do. And it's also incremental. So what we do when we do this testing aspect of behavioral science is we try to not necessarily do sort of one project and then say, this is what we should do everywhere. We might do a few projects sort of iteratively to build on what we know in an evidence base, an area, to then do something with a variety of pieces of understanding, as opposed to just sort of one big piece. And then lastly, this guide also explores considerations for getting started. So obviously it's what it's about, but things such as capacity and skills. So there's a lot here we could talk about regarding how do you apply behavioral science, what is the skill set, it's kind of a bit amorphous as I've described it. It's all these academic disciplines, there's testing involved, what does it mean to be a behavioral scientist? So we can also answer some questions around that. If you're interested to know more about what it might mean to either learn skills that you could use to apply behavioral science, or to maybe engage with behavioral scientists, what you might need to know there. And the guide starts to explore some of that in the sections as well. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Claire for her section.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, we wanted to tackle the guide in a way that really spoke to the experiences of the UN entities that have been practicing behavioral science in some way or another, so to reflect their experiences and also to speak to some of the real conditions that are experienced on the ground. And so essentially we're focusing on building off of existing guides and trying to adapt them to some degree by using examples that are actually being put in place by UN entities. So the first real part of the guide dives into how to improve policies and programs. And maybe if we can already go to the next slide. We started by breaking it down into these really 5 major steps. And again, these steps are reflective of the steps that you find in a lot of models. So it's really based on practice well beyond the UN entities, while taking into account the realities that our colleagues are facing on the ground. So the first step that we're looking at is really about defining the outcome and the target behavior. Defining the outcome in the sense of, what a lot of us are already familiar with. There's a policy outcome that we're working towards, but then to add to that analysis, there are also some tools and things like that to help you identify what the target behavior is, which is a whole different process in a sense, but we each time are trying to put it into context for taking into account the process that colleagues are already part of. The second large step is really about understanding the context. So you've identified the target behavior, and then you go deeper into the context and understanding of why people are behaving differently than what you want them to, and what some of the factors are that are at play in influencing that behavior and the behavior that you want to actually achieve. And from that diagnostic, you're really going to start designing a behaviorally informed intervention. And so in that section, we're really looking at, again, a lot of external resources about, how to get creative and use the diagnostic information to design an intervention that really is relevant for the local situation. And again, there's sort of a transversal element here that everybody will be familiar with, which is stakeholder engagement. So at every step of the way, there's also sort of, tips about at what point and how to engage with stakeholders, the value that they bring in shaping these interventions and understanding the analysis, and also the extent to which, reference should be made to trained behavioral scientists to help make sure that there's a rigor to the practices that are taking place. And then once you have this behavioral intervention that's designed, you run the test, you evaluate it, and finally, when you're looking at the results of the evaluation, you then decide on what the next steps are. Were the results what you expected? Were they positive? What can you learn from them? Do you need to adapt the experiment and run it again? Or can you scale up? Are you at the stage already where you can scale up on the results? And then, of course, communicating the findings. So I just want to dive a little bit deeper into, just how the guide has been constructed. And I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So there's 3 different items I want to attract your attention to. So the first is, the guide really presents the reader with key questions. It is not prescriptive. We're not telling you what to do exactly. It's more about guiding questions of, what you should be thinking about to make sure that the behavioral science analysis and intervention is on track. So it's each stage of the process. So say you've chosen a policy outcome to increase household recycling. The guide will then take you through some key questions to help you identify a target behavior. So here you see, what is the policy or program problem in question? Who are the stakeholders involved? What is the desired outcome? And again, some of them are going to be quite intuitive, already embedded in the work that we're doing, but other ones are a little bit more specific. So what specific behaviors are involved that are likely to impact the current outcome? Behavior, do you have evidence of the incidence of the current behavior? And other questions that you would want to ask yourself that you may not be thinking about without this behavioral lens in place. I think one really important point is that there are always examples. And again, these examples are pulled each time from, examples, real life examples. So here in the bottom, you have this example of recycling. And we try to illustrate what the result of this particular step should be. So the second item that I think is important to mention is that the guide provides alternatives to match resources and capacity. As Mary mentioned, I think a lot of the entities are at different stages of applying behavioral science, and it's not always very obvious to do a full-blown intervention. And sometimes the conditions don't warrant it. And it's difficult, I think, for us at the United Nations to decide at what point it makes sense to go forward. If we have enough resources, if we have enough time. I know the COVID crisis really had a big impact on the feasibility of certain things. So there are, again, questions that are there to help in making some of these decisions, and also examples of how to take an alternative approach. Let's say if there's not a full, not an opportunity to do a full-scale behavioral intervention. So, for example, evaluation is a really key one. in behavioral science, we're often talking about and looking at published work about interventions where there were, they were carried out through a randomized controlled experiment. But we know that this is a method of evaluation that, at once is fundamental to behavioral science because it's the reason why results can be considered reliable often, but at the same time, the conditions don't always permit it. So the guide provides some examples of, other ways that you can use, that you can evaluate and, for example, quasi-experimental methods or qualitative methods, or simply using the results from the diagnostic phase and more in-depth research to design, analyze, or amend programs or policies. So we wanted to take into account all of those different levels of capacity and resources. And then finally, I think that there's also some interesting content, let's say, about what to do with the research once you have finished it. I think there, sadly, is often a tendency to finish the research, share the results, and then you move on to something else. But there's something really inherent in the practice of behavioral science that's about learning from the results, whether they're positive or negative, whether it was successful or not. And so there are also some tips on that front about what you can do, for example, if the results were not positive, and also how to use the results if they were positive through the stakeholders and communication and different strategies of that sort. And most importantly, iteration, which is kind of fundamental in the long term, also to continue to improve on the program and policy design in the long term. So I'll leave it there and pass it on to Lucy.
Thanks, Claire. Mary, if you don't mind putting back the slides, then I'll use that as a support. So hi, everyone. So I just want to talk with you a little bit about section 4 of the practitioner's guide. So if you look at the guide, you will see that section 4 is about applying behavioral science to administrative processes. So why do we have a section in the guide specifically about admin? Why do we care? Well, there are two big reasons. The first reason is that administrative processes have been identified as a key area where behavioral science can really add value at the UN. So if you look at the guidance note and the behavioral science documentation that has come out from the Secretary General recently, administrative burdens are highlighted as a special area to prioritize. And this is because tackling administrative burdens can help us improve access to many programs and policies that you might be working on at the UN. So for example, reducing paperwork requirements or other behavioral frictions to make it easier to sign up for a vaccine program, or to reduce the amount of documentation that people have to provide when they register for an educational program and so on. So reducing paperwork requirements can help better deliver programs so that more people can access them more easily. But reducing administrative burdens and requirements can also help to tackle inefficiencies within the internal workings of the UN. So a lot of people that I've talked with across UN entities have highlighted that often as somebody who works for the UN, you face a lot of administrative burdens when you deal with travel authorizations or with procurement, requirements, accessing employee benefits. So if any of these sound familiar at your organization, then it might be that tackling administrative burdens might help it function more efficiently. So overall, simplifying, reducing, and tackling paperwork requirements is a priority at the UN, and that's why we wrote section 4, focusing on it specifically. What about the second reason? And on the next slide, I can tell you a bit more about the second reason. So the second reason why we dedicated a section in the guide to administrative burdens is that behavioral science projects that tackle administrative burdens are a little bit different from behavioral science projects in general. Why? Because when we look at administrative burdens, we're trying to figure out if there are excessive or unjustified requirements on people through complex processes or paperwork requirements that are making it harder for the UN to function, or for people in the population that the UN serves to access the UN's programs and policies. And so a big part of work on reducing administrative burdens is not just to change behavior, but also to identify inefficiencies in the system and to reduce the costs of this behavior. For example, make it take up less time, make it less frustrating, and so on. So in order to make it a little bit more concrete in your mind, I wanted to give you some examples of what excessive administrative burdens can look like. And to do that, the concept of sludge is really useful for us. So sludge is a term from behavioral science that refers to excessive or unjustified frictions or rules, requirements, administrative or paperwork burdens that make it harder for us to do what we want. So what could sludge look like? One way that sludge could appear in internal or external processes at the UN is through the form of excessive paperwork or complex processes. So think about trying to sign up for a cash transfer program and having to show bank splits or your small business accounts or any other information like that to a social worker. That's a big barrier to overcome if that information is complicated or difficult to find. Or you might sign up for a vaccine program, but there is a very long waiting time, and that's another friction that can be very discouraging. Often, and this could be, for example, in internal processes like recruitment or procurement, you have to look for information that is not all in one place, but instead you have to check out different teams or different organizations' websites, some guidelines, a web page with rules and so on. And all of that means that when you interact with a process that involves sludge, you can incur a lot of costs. So what kind of costs can sludge cause? It can take up your time if you have to fill out a long application form. It can take your money if you're actually missing out on carrying out normal work because you have to take out a half day to interact with the UN policy. And it can also have emotional costs. So sometimes when we impose a lot of requirements on people in order to access our programs or policies, that can make them feel disrespected or sometimes embarrassed and so on. And so that's something that we really want to avoid. And of course, more simply in internal processes, it can be very frustrating to have to put in more travel requests or go through very complex recruitment processes when you're just trying to get work done, right? So all in all, when you have excessively costly administrative processes or paperwork requirements, it can take up a lot of effort, and that discourages action. Because we know from behavioral science, then even just adding one extra click before you access an online application, even just asking people to go to an office down the street to fill out one more form and so on, that can really make a very big difference in whether people actually complete the administrative process. And sludge does not impact all of us equally. In fact, there is quite a lot of evidence from behavioral science that suggests that those of us who have mental or physical health problems, who have less human capital resources, whether that's time, money, education, cognitive skills, people who have financial issues and so on, all of these groups are more affected than people who don't face these challenges when they deal with complex administrative processes. So not only can sludge be costly, but it's more costly for disadvantaged groups, and so it may increase inequality. And all in all, because of all of these costs that I discussed, when an administrative burden is excessive, then it can hamper people, prevent them from making informed decisions and following through with these decisions. So with all of that in mind, we wanted to dedicate a section of the guide to sludge and tailor it to the UN's needs, because we believe that we can use evidence from behavioral science and the methods that Claire and Mary detailed that come with it to better tackle sludge at the UN. And this would allow us to deliver programs more easily, make it easier for people to access and to sign up to our policies. It would make it easier to access benefits, and this could be either benefits that the UN distributes or that internal employees access. Reducing sludge could even make planning missions more efficient. When you think about all of the steps that are involved before you go on mission, imagine if you were able to cut a lot of the duplicate or excessively long or complex requirements. Procurement and recruitment are two other areas that I named, but I just want to conclude by saying, basically just take a look at section 4 in the guide, see if you can think of any programs or policies that you're working on, or even internal processes that your organization faces, and see if behavioral science could help you improve these processes. And I'll give it back to Mary now.
Great, thanks for that good comprehensive introduction to sludge there. I know you need to leave in a few minutes, Lucy, so I'm going to conclude with a slide, but we do have a question from the audience about how you can use behavioral science administrative burden to look at talent management. Any thoughts on that area? I know you briefly touched upon recruitment, hiring, kind of those spaces, but anything else in that talent management space you might have insight?
Yeah, I mean, basically any administrative or costly processes that exist in your talent management practices are something that you can think through the lens of sludge reduction. So while I'm not familiar with what talent management looks like at your organization, let's say that you have regular reviews or that manager or employees need to fill out forms about their performance and so on, a good first step could be to look at these processes and think about what they are achieving, what they are not achieving, if there is any duplicate collection of information. So when we are asking people to invest time and effort into processes, is the benefits from filling out that form or having that meeting higher than the cost of the time and effort of that process? So it could look like making it slightly less frequent, or simplifying questions, or if it's information you're already collecting via other measures, you could then reduce the number of questions that you're asking people about. So this is all through my understanding that talent management means reviewing employee performance. But if you meant more so like hiring people and promoting them and so on, then there's also a lot of behavioral science evidence on these processes that you could look at. So for example, the promotion process is something that can be behaviorally informed. There are some studies that look at what is the least biased way of enacting promotion. So for example, you can anonymize the evaluation of employees' performance, or for recruitment, there is some work that was done in another part of the UN with simplifying people's CV or candidate profile, so they didn't have to give information that they had already given many times before, or so that they could sort of compress the amount of information that they had to give. So basically, I don't know exactly what processes you have in mind, but if you're involved in talent management, I would suggest to look at the type of processes that people complain the most about, or that you don't get as much out of than you feel you should, given the effort that people have to put into it. And then you can start to think through, okay, what are the costs of these processes? What do we get out of this process? And is there any way that we could simplify this process? Can we make the language easier? Can we make it shorter? Can we take out steps that aren't really needed? Are we collecting information that we already collect through some other form that we could then not have to ask people about again, and so on and so forth? I'm really sorry I have to run off, but I hope that's somewhat useful. And I'll just leave my email address in the chat now. So if anybody has any questions, please get in touch if you have ideas for a sludge project and so on, and I'll do my best to point you in the right direction, or give you resources. But yeah, thank you everyone. Bye-bye.
Great, thanks, Lucy. And I can also put in the chat, there's some resources from an academic who works in this space too. There's a portal of, particularly when it comes to biases, gender, and different areas of sort of recruitment and retention, talent management overall. If that might be useful to you, I'll put that after my last slide. So I see some questions coming in. So if you want to give you a few more minutes to do that, I'm going to go to the last slide. Basically, it's just sort of how to keep engaged with us, how to continue on your journey. So first is to read some of the documents. So in addition to the UN Practitioner's Guide to Getting Started with Behavioral Science, there's also a guidance note from the Secretary General on the application of behavioral science, as well as the UN Behavioral Science Report, which covers the experiences of 25 UN entities, which not only projects are in there from the UN, but also what entities are doing with respect to behavioral science overall, to give you a bit of an overview. So those are the resources that were shared earlier in the chat. And again, I'll put them when I conclude. You can also join the UN Behavioral Science group. If you're here, you're probably part of the group, but you can also promote it to friends, colleagues. There's the group within the UN. And then we also have a group of observers from outside the UN, observers. And these observers come from academia, other international organizations, governments, civil society, NGOs, so private sector. Really what we're aiming for the observers position is to have a broader community we can engage with, whether it's through events or through sharing what we're doing in the UN overall. So you can share the link and join if you haven't done so already, or promote that with your friends and colleagues. And then lastly, you can follow us on Twitter. We are UN_BSci as well as UN_innovation. And there you can get a bit of a more real-time understanding of what's going on in the UN. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides, and I will put some more links in the chat. But before I do that, maybe I'll just take a couple of questions here and Claire can answer with me. So we have one from an anonymous attendee who says, when should I use this guide? Can I run an experiment with it? So maybe we need to give some clarity around, who's the audience of this guide and where you should take it from there. So maybe I'll turn that over to you, Claire, and I can put some things in the chat. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, this is a really excellent question. And I think that the short answer in a way is no, the intention of the guide was not to walk you through a full-blown experiment. There were a lot of consultations with staff across the UN entities who were practicing behavioral science in some form or another to really try to understand, what their practices were currently, what kind of tool would be the most useful. And also a huge amount of, let's say, research looking at existing guides and documents from established government entities, government agencies that have behavioral science units, the behavioral insights team, a lot of the behavioral science companies that we know have been doing really great work. And from all of this, I suppose that one really important thing to know is that there are some fantastic resources out there, and many of them you will find in the annexes to the report. So there's 2 primary annexes, and they provide resources on every step of the process, really, from the diagnostic phase and how to develop those tools to, tips on how to design the interventions, and some really excellent tools on how to evaluate the interventions. So I think that these resources in the annexes are really critical if you want to take that practice further. And again, since we knew also that the UN entities across the board are at various levels of applying behavioral science, the implementation guide, or let's say that the practitioner's guide is what we called it in the end, is really to provide an overall framework of understanding what the steps are, knowing that most of the staff at the UN who are going to be engaging with this at some point or another are going to have to work with trained behavioral scientists or people who are trained to do impact evaluation methods to be able to bring the whole behavioral science project together. It's really not a one-person job. I think the section in the beginning of the report, sorry, not the report, the guide, shows different ways of building the team, basically, that would need to be put together to successfully carry out a full-scale behavioral intervention, which is always what we want to try to work towards. But again, I think there's a lot in the guide also about choosing when to use. Is behavioral science the right tool? Is it really what you want to use at this, for this particular challenge that you're facing? And we thought it better to focus on some of those questions that people are facing along the way, rather than to do basically, reinventing the wheel of guides that already exist on how to run evaluations. Mary?
Great, thanks for that really comprehensive answer, Claire. I think that really answers a lot of what we're intended to do with this guide and what's the purpose is. And again, we're trying to meet the UN where a lot of colleagues are, which is at those early stages and thinking through and conceptualizing. One thing that we often see going across entities is that there's a lot of enthusiasm and interest for behavioral science. Then when you start to do it, there's sometimes some complexities where you need to kind of get that extra understanding of what's needed, what isn't needed to do a project. And that's really what this is intended to do. So again, we're here to answer questions you might have about the guide or any other ways of applying behavioral science. So we can also speak with you if you would like some more information, but the guide was intended to be that piece for you. Okay, so we have quite a few questions coming in. I might take a few. So we have one about what's the difference between running a behavioral insights project for programs versus administration. So maybe we can outline some of that we put in the guide, but we can maybe speak to that a little bit. And then maybe we'll cover a few questions, and if there's time, we can open up for comments from the audience as well. There's also a question about how do you go about, quote, selling behavioral science to colleagues who may not be familiar with the subject and whom the fit sort of don't fit with the current work, the way of working, may not be so obvious. So that's a question as well about, being new to behavioral science and how do you sell it. So maybe I'll take a go at those, and then Claire, if you want to come in, I'm sure you have some thoughts as well. So in terms of the difference between programs and administration, so I think with the guide, what we really tried to do is to say the steps in behavioral science application, I mean, roughly are similar, right? There's, as Claire outlined, those steps that there's understanding the context, there's thinking about what kind of behavioral science you want to apply, and then there's testing and evaluating, and then ultimately communicating that onto some impact and iterating on that process. So those steps are broadly the same. What's different is a lot of kind of the ways in which you'd go about doing this in a more nitty-gritty sense. So like how you determine the context in a field program in a complex setting might be very different for how you determine the context of how an employee will access a benefit in the UN. So you might use different methods. It could be, the guide goes through quite a few of these. It could be qualitative discussions that you have. It could be quantitative data that you collect. So it might vary depending on what you do, but in essence, the steps are the same. So that might be helpful, might not, but I'm happy to dig. If you have some specific examples, we can also perhaps speak to those. And then with respect to how to speak about behavioral science, so in that first slide there that I had spoke to, there are a few areas that we outlined that I think have resonated to some extent in terms of the UN seeing the value of behavioral science. So I mentioned it can increase the impact of existing programs and policies in the UN. It can enhance efficiency. As I said, some of these things are relatively simple to do, and they can have a big impact. So not only just the impact, but the efficiency as well. Is also this evidence-based approach, which maybe doesn't resonate as much, but I do think, having a program or policy that is based upon really strong principles and ideas can really resonate with donors too and other key stakeholders. So those kind of the areas that we've identified resonate, but I do also say each entity is very different in terms of where this fits into their work and how they see behavioral science. Some of this also comes down to the different disciplines. Economists see this differently from health specialists, sometimes from others. So we often try to think about that too, of how do we obviously speak about it in a way that resonates with the entity itself. But I'll stop there. Claire, what do you think about those two questions regarding programs and administration, and then also how do you speak about behavioral science? I know you were in the ILO, you've been doing this in the ILO yourself, so you definitely have some firsthand experience in this space too. Over to you.
Yeah, I would say on the first question, maybe one factor that's interesting to take into account, because again, as Mary said, the steps are by and large the same. But there are always different layers to take into account. And I think that there's a layer of sort of the organizational or institutional psychology, let's say, that is a little bit more specific to the administrative application, which, similar factors exist out there in the wild, let's say. But I do think that there's kind of a substantial amount of literature that's dealing specifically with behavior change with
I'm not sure if we've lost Claire. Okay, maybe we can try to get her to come back online, but I can keep going through some of the questions here while we see if Claire can rejoin. Okay, so we also have, so we have oh, Claire, are you there? I think you're back now. Oh, but we can't hear you.
I think the internet is
oh, no.
maybe going out a bit. Can you hear me?
I think we got part of your answer. Did you want to finish what you were saying? I don't know where exactly we cut out, but.
I guess if you can still hear me now.
It's fine.
Okay, the second piece, the second question I was going to say that, let's say, let me just find,
the second question was with respect to selling behavioral science in your organization.
Right, selling behavioral science, absolutely. So I think that, in the beginning of the document, we do talk a little bit about some of the specifics of, again, the questions that you might ask yourself at the beginning of a project or before carrying out a project. And some of those questions also help to address some of the typical concerns that come up, let's say. People might be concerned that it's going to be too expensive or take too much time, or, what's the point of behavioral science in this particular situation? And I think, the guide includes some questions that should help you think through some of that and construct some arguments. I think the most typical ones are indeed that, the expense, the time, and is it ethical? And there's a very important section of the guide that deals with the ethics of behavioral science and how to apply behavioral science in an ethical way, the steps that you should take. But I think essentially the arguments that I often make in my environment, that is a very sort of policy-oriented organization, the International Labour Organization, we're really looking to make the point that behavioral science is one tool that can help promote policies that will be going more within the grain of human behavior. So, it won't replace policy. It's not going to be used to say that, there should not be any regulation. Instead, it's going to be used to increase compliance with existing laws and policies, which I think is a very important argument in my organization. It might be something different in a different organization. So again, I think the guide, given the heterogeneity of the UN and its entities, can't be too prescriptive on exactly what arguments are going to work. But frequently, I think selling it, to me, has really been about showing that you can have measurable results, that you can show these results and then build on them and avoid the extra costs of implementing a program that you don't know if it's going to work necessarily. And also this point that, it takes into account human behavior and therefore makes policies and programs more effective. But again, I think it really needs to be tailored to the specific entities.
Yes, and this is very much agree with that, Claire. It's really nice to have your firsthand experience of doing this within the ILO too, to speak to that. And this is something that we're actually talking to quite a few entities about, and how to do this. So how to get started, how to have discussions with more senior individuals in your organization. So we are very much promoting behavioral science across the UN. So if this is something that you think there's interest or demand for, I mean, we'd be very happy to have a conversation with you about how you can go from, trying to start a first project, or even going from one project to more within your entity, because as Claire mentioned there, it's diversity across the UN, but there are also some shared experiences that if we can leverage together, maybe there are ways we can collectively also promote behavioral science in our organizations. Okay, so I'll keep going through a few, but I see Michael Lund wanted to ask a question. I can try to unmute you if you'd like to speak yourself. You can now talk if you'd like to ask your question.
Thank you, Mary. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. Sorry, because I also wanted to add a comment. It was just easier for me to do it. Thanks so much for this presentation and for giving us the guide. One thing on the administrative burden element. So I think when we look at sludge, to me, it's a broader concept than administrative burdens. Administrative burdens looks at how the processes and functions, but sludge is a broader concept of what gets in the way of us achieving our goals, which is not only administrative burdens, it can also be what are our goals? Are we clear what our goals are? Do I need to attend 10 meetings where there are 10 other colleagues in order for me to meet my goal? And if I don't, what does that do to my motivations and my ability to perform on a Tuesday morning in general? So in UNDP, we're trying to, I'm trying to look at this from a broader context, or a broader understanding of it, but looking at the organization itself. So it's not about, the way that I'm looking at it right now is not about how do we reduce sludge for our beneficiaries, but how do we reduce sludge in our own organization in order to achieve our goals. And we have been, my question is then this, we have been trying to do a bit of research around what methodologies exist on this, and we have been hopelessly unsuccessful in finding some really practical tools on doing this. We're trying to come up with our own, but that obviously has its own limitations. So basically my question out here is that if there's anybody who has any experience with doing a sludge analysis on internal processes. Cass Sunstein talk about the administrative processes and do a sludge audit, but what does that actually mean? What do I do? How do I actually do it? So that would be really helpful. There's anybody on this call, please be in touch. I'll put my my email in the Q&A. So that was one. Thanks for that. The second one is on sort of generally our experience with implementing behavioral science initiatives. When we did a sort of just an overview, and you guys, and actually it was you, Mary, that prompted us to do that, to find out what exists out there of behavioral science initiatives in the UN. And as we did that sort of overview a year ago, we have, I think 57 initiatives that apply behavioral science. So it's quite a number. What we haven't done is do sort of a cross-project analysis on how successful these behavioral science and interventions have been, and what can we learn from them. If we have only used an outfit for 3 months, has that meant that we didn't continue after 3 months with the behavioral science approach? I'm just making that example up, but we're really looking at trying to find a way of looking across different types of projects, but focusing in on the behavioral science initiative as part of those projects. And I just wanted to know if there's anybody else out there who has an experience with that kind of cross-project evaluation or lessons learned of initiative that has a behavioral science component to it. If there is, please also let me know, because we would like to conduct that. And thanks for giving me the floor, Mary. Back to you.
Great, thanks for your comments, Michael. He's been doing some really good work over at UNDP in terms of thinking about sludge reduction, and it's called the integration review, if I can mention it. I don't know if there's a reason why you didn't mention it, but it's a really interesting exercise that was carried out to think about actually how to apply behavioral science for the UN to work better together. So it's really interesting work there. We can maybe share that as well. But in terms of your questions, so some comments here with respect to sludge. So I encourage you to get in touch with Lucy, because she's actually doing a sludge audit within the UN right now. And she's speaking to, I believe you spoke to them as well. There's the New South Wales government in Australia who've been doing this work in sludge or administrative burden reduction for a number of years. So there's sort of some growing literature and evidence in the space about how to do a sludge audit. So she'll have more to share from her lessons within the UN, as well as through talking to them and others across academia and practice. So that might be something that would be helpful to you. And then with respect to the effectiveness of behavioral science in the UN, so I'm not sure if I understood that correctly, but is this that you wanted to find examples of behavioral science in the UN broadly, and then to what extent they are effective, and then to get some lessons around that? Because if that is the case, then the UN Behavioral Science Report, Johanna and I, we did quite a bit of editing of all of the submissions. We really asked every entity to give us impact metrics, so as best they could. Like, for instance, Claire gave examples of field experiments she ran with the ILO, and she had the numbers to showing the impact of what, to the extent they worked or didn't work. That was just a paragraph, but that might be a clue in terms of thinking about what's been in the UN and what's worked or hasn't worked. And there's some information in the report there around that, if you wanted to dive there. But maybe I didn't quite understand what you were after in terms of the effectiveness of interventions in the UN.
So I can come in again, Mary, is okay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thanks. So on the first one, yes, I didn't actually mention all the work on integration, which will be online for all UN staff really soon. We're just trying to solve IT issues. We're actually done with it, and we are quite excited about it. At the moment, it's at the knowledge gateway, but that's not where. Well, maybe it's not where it will be anchored. But I'll let you, Mary, know when it's up and available, and then you can share it with the broader community. So, and just on the sludge audit, so what we have looked at what the Australians have been doing, but to me, at least what I could find so far, it's more looking at the beneficiaries and more looking at reducing the administrative burden of the beneficiaries. What we are looking at is more the internal organizational issues of, so what gets in the way of us achieving our daily work, not necessarily how difficult is it for the beneficiary to access the services. So it's a little bit of a slightly different focus. So it's just, I will get in touch with Lucy, but if there is anybody who has experience with that. I do know that we do measure sort of impact or results or lessons from individual projects. What I'm looking at is across projects. So are there lessons that we can learn across, so we can ask the same type of question for 50 projects? Would be amazing to me. So for example, how sustainable have behavioral initiatives been after the disengagement of experts? Has it anchored in the organization, or is it over when we don't have external expertise? one question. Another question could be, how long is the sweet spot for how long we need to have external engagement? Is 3 months enough? Is 1 year? Because obviously that also comes with cost, and it's not cheap the way that these things often operate. So those kind of questions across projects, and maybe within the same organization, so it's kind of, we have the same way of operating. It doesn't have to be, it can be across organizations too. But if anybody has done that kind of cross project analysis or lessons learned, that would be super interesting. So not just the project itself, but across several projects applying a behavioral science lens. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for that, Michael. That's helpful. And we'll definitely share the integration review when you have it. We have a newsletter that comes out every few months. So just to flag as well, if anybody has any resources coming out of their entities on behavioral science you'd like to promote, we can also include them. And then with respect to, how to engage with others and what's the optimal amount of time to engage with a partner. Maybe Claire can comment on this as well, but I would say there's a huge amount of heterogeneity in this amount of to what extent do you need a partner. It varies from project to project. It varies from entity to entity. I personally look at quite a few terms of reference when it comes to engaging with external behavioral scientists, bringing them into the UN, and each one is quite different. So I think my first reaction might be that'd be hard to kind of get to some clear conclusions around that immediately from what we've seen in the UN thus far, but it's definitely an interesting discussion that we should be having across the UN. So I don't know, Claire, do you have any thoughts on that, engaging with external partners and kind of to what extent, what's optimal, how do you know what's optimal? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that we're sort of in a situation, most entities are probably in a situation where engaging with external partners is not really a choice, in the sense that we don't have the capacity internally to do everything by ourselves. And so we will have to, in some way or another, engage with external collaborators, partners. And at least I think in our experience, it's a little bit learning by doing. And I think that that's exactly why the UN Behavioral Science Group, honestly, is such a fantastic resource, because, then you can sort of multiply the learnings by exchanging with other colleagues who've been through similar processes, who might have, takeaways that can serve you. So I think that's the main thing that I would say of use. But I do think that, kind of shared resources around, criteria for selecting partners, what to look for, draft terms of reference. These are all tools that I find particularly useful, and also tools that I know the UN Behavioral Science Group has talked about, sharing among ourselves at some point as well. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, great. Thanks, Claire. So there are a few more questions here. I'll try to get to quickly a few of them. So in the last few minutes. So the first is with respect to culture change in organizations. So the guidance talks about more incremental changes and smaller changes as opposed to these big sort of larger systemic things. So why is that? It seems like there's a big potential for behavioral science to shape the culture. So why are we looking at behaviors? So there's a question around that, Claire, you can address. And then there's also a question again about applying some of what is learned by colleagues and people taking it seriously. I know the more knowledge I gain, experience would be better, but I wonder if there's any tips from experience in terms of how to gain buy-in. So again, another question on buy-in. This is maybe more with project managers and field staff, so more of a maybe like detailed nitty-gritty. And I know Claire mentioned that in her remarks about the importance of stakeholders and consultation. So how do we do that, and what will be some tips there? And then maybe I'll say there's another question about recruiting program participants. Literature on examples of how evaluating sludge. So specifically, I think this goes to one of the comments Lucy made about, cash transfer programs and how to reduce sludge there could have actually a large impact. So, is there any literature around that we can maybe speak to, particularly in sludge reduction in that context? So I can maybe speak to one of those, but maybe to start, Claire, did you want to say a few thoughts on culture change versus individual behaviors, and then around lessons learned, again, more the project manager, field staff level of bringing people on board?
Sure. I think what's underlying this question is what is culture? How does behavior relate to culture? And to keep things short now, behavioral science really focuses on changing elements of the context primarily to change individual behavior. And then if you look to, things like social norms or diffusion of innovation, it starts to look at how that behavior then spreads to create an a cultural shift at the organizational level. So I would say it's not that behavioral science doesn't do this. It does, but it takes a very particular approach to it. And I think, again, sludge is one approach, and there are other approaches that are based on behavioral science that might also look at different elements, that might look a little bit more closely at attitudes and perceptions and how those are influencing behavior and things like that. But I think if you're looking for cultural change in an organization, that there's always going to be a behavioral element to it on the individual level, and how that behavior is shaped by your peers and how it's influenced. And so if you're doing a diagnostic, you would build that into the diagnostic. You would try to understand how behavior is basically being influenced by peer groups and things like that. So I think culture is part of it, but it's maybe not the focus of the guide, and not the focus of the sludge audits in particular. But I guess on the question of buy-in, often I find if we're talking about the people who are really going to be carrying out the behavioral science, I think there's different approaches to it. Some people really like the fact that it's innovative. Other people get really stressed if it's innovative. So, sometimes you just have to sort of learn to read a little bit the team that's going to be working on it, and tailor messages. But, I've certainly felt that the people who picked it up first were people who were hungry for innovation. And so there wasn't really much need to get them on board. They just wanted to know, is there a chance that this can work? Is anybody else doing it? If they're not doing it yet, I want to be the first one to do it. And, that then it just sort of takes off. And then for the people who are more reluctant, typically they will be the ones who are maybe a little bit nervous about failure, maybe a little bit more nervous about risks. They're more sensitive to risks. So you might think about what some of the risks are of behavioral science and try to, tackle them at the outset. And, I think some of the risks of behavioral science are pretty transparent in a lot of the material that's out there about, is it expensive? Again, is it expensive? Is it going to take time? And although, that can be a concern more for upper management, I think people working, down the line are also really interested in some of that as well, because everybody wants to be part of a project that's going to work, right? And nobody really wants to feel like they're going to get dragged into something that might not be successful, as we say. So I think sort of painting a picture of, this is sort of a new approach to something that, again, one new tool in the toolkit. It doesn't have to be absolutely revolutionary. It's just another approach to what we're doing, and that it might complement other methods. I don't know. It's a difficult question to answer because it's so particular to each, different personality types and different teams, different hierarchies and power within the organization and things like that. But I normally try to think about it as those two broad categories. Are they people who are typically interested in innovation and wanting to be part of that forefront, or are they people who are more concerned about the risks that would be involved? And in that case, how can you address the risks?
Great. Thanks for that, Claire. I think we're getting close to time, but with respect to the last question, I'll just put a source in the chat of some initiatives when it comes to applying behavioral science to cash transfer programs. There's been quite a bit of work by the World Bank. So if you are curious to explore this further, I'd be happy to connect you with colleagues in the World Bank to get some insights from them about how they've done this with partners as well. So I'll just put that here. That's a cash transfer link to some programs around the world. But with that, I'm going to conclude today's session. I know we have some more questions we weren't able to address. Thank you, Christelle from ICAO, regarding some comments about the guide, how it's useful to you. Appreciate that. Again, this intention of today's session was to really share with you, but we also want feedback from you as well. So if you start to think about it, read it, you find it resonates with you in some ways, maybe doesn't in others, let us know. We can maybe think about ways we can think about our messaging or how we talk about the guide and work together in this space overall. And with that, thank you very much for joining us today and looking forward to seeing you at another webinar soon. Okay, bye everyone.